Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Today we're going to deal with some analysis in terms of Watts's account of sleeping in the basement, as well as briefly contraindications around Shanann's Imitrex, her headache medication. What is strange is how reality seems to shift when we revisit the old footage. It sometimes feels like we're in a kind of a slippage of reality and of time and of truth and all sorts of things. When we go back and we look at, for example, the Sermon on the Porch, when we look at the body cam footage, it just seems like there's a lot more context now to what we know, but at the same time there's also quite a lot of sort of shifting contexts, some of which we are aware of and some of which we don't agree with or whatever. But it's really interesting watching some of that footage again and seeing how Watts is sort of creating his own reality. And I think that's also part of the horror of this case. Is the reality was that his family were dead, and yet he was sort of almost like in a fantasy land. It was like, even though he was acting that nothing was wrong, it was almost like part of him seemed to really believe it, and part of him seemed to have forgotten what was actually going on. So, if anything, this case seems to show the capacity for human delusion, and this is why I think it would be interesting if Watts did take some kind of personality test or some kind of psychological evaluation, because there does seem to be a tendency here for delusion, for someone who's so caught up in a lifetime of lies and a lifestyle of lies that the truth becomes almost flexible, but more than that, the truth becomes sort of something that you can fashion any way you want and customize it any way you want, and that sort of thing. And although it's incredibly disturbing in this case, it's incredibly disturbing to look at Watts and to say, this is despicable, and it's obvious that you're lying. I think this is emblematic of society today. We're looking at a society where we can't really trust what the media says. It's very difficult to say what is true anymore, and who can sort of put up their hands and say, we are true. And I kind of experienced that myself when I contacted a journalist, and you expect journalists to be more informed and better informed. And when you're talking to a journalist and then they have a separate reality, it's pretty shocking. And I mean, a journalist is tasked with, in a way, being a conduit to our realities. In other words, they are the sort of fountainhead through which reality flows. And so if what they know isn't correct or isn't true or isn't informed, it distorts it for everybody else. And I think that's one of the reasons why I started True Crime Rocket Science, and why I named it True Crime Rocket Science, is because you are trying to stand apart as something that's reliable. But obviously all of us are fallible. All of us are, even if we're trying not to see things the way that we that we are programmed, it's very difficult not to. As I've said in other episodes, the way to I guess get to True Crime Rocket Science is to see these criminals through their eyes. So to try and get into their shoes and get into their dynamics, and not see them through our own context, which we tend to do. So we're going to get into that in a moment. at the end of this episode, I also want to touch on an aspect which I also think touches on subjectivity, and it also touches on our perceptions of this case, and which is over the course of the three confessions, there's been kind of a perception, and in my view a misperception, that if Watts provides a version that's worse, then it must be true, right? And again, we taking that view from our own perspective. In other words, we're saying, yes, it's worse for us, so it must be true. And this is what I mean. In the first confession, you kind of had a situation where Watts said, I don't know where my children are, they've vanished, they've disappeared. That's not a really bad situation, but it wasn't believable. Then when he told the interrogators that Shanann had murdered his children and that he had then murdered her, because that's a worse scenario, people are inclined to say, well, that's got to be true because it's worse than the other scenario, and it's certainly not making him look very good, so why would he admit that, right? Then in the second confession, he admits to all three of the murders, and then people said the same thing. They said, well, this version's got to be true because it's much worse than the last version. And the same thing has happened in the third confession, where now it's two, it's attempted murder and then murder and so on. And I don't agree with that. I don't think that psychology works at all, where you say, well, because it's a worse version, it must be true. What does make sense with that is that, for example, there are certain aspects that are true in these embellished versions, such as, I believe, the OxyContin or oxycodone. I believe that did play a factor in this case, and it's only been acknowledged sort of for the first time in this third confession, whereas it has been in the discovery all along, and it makes sense, right? Anyway, we will get back to that. Before we do, please subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and please like and leave a comment, and let's get going. So the basement spiel is basically the story that Chris Watts gave on the sort of afternoon of the murders on Monday, August 13th, sort of late-ish in the afternoon. And at this stage there were three officers in his lounge, and it sort of appears as if Nicole Atkinson and her son and her daughter had sort of left the house at this point. So it looks like it was quite late in the afternoon, and at this point I think Watts is quite tired. I think he's tired from lack of sleep, but he's also just tired from pretending. And although he is still sort of keeping up the appearance, and although he's still trying to put his game face on, he doesn't seem to be succeeding, because the police are still in his house because they're not convinced. And although they're giving him the benefit of the doubt, it's kind of because they're forced to. It's kind of because there's no smoking gun. There's nothing that they have that they can obviously suspect him. The best that they kind of have is like a gut feel that it doesn't really add up and it doesn't quite make sense. And it's unfortunate that, and maybe this is something police can bear in mind in future, is where you take statements from someone and then make sure that you get the details right. Make sure that the little details, for example, was it an emotional argument? Was it very emotional, or wasn't it emotional? Make sure that those details are accounted for, and then a policeman can ask Watts a question like that. How come you've said something else here? right? An interrogator may not be as on the chin as that, but a policeman can certainly put him on the spot and say, "Hey, why is there a mismatch in what you're saying?" And so one of the examples of this is the basement spiel, right? And we're going to deal with that now.
And is someone sleeping in the basement?
I did a few times the separation thing. I just struck.
How recently?
Probably about 2 nights ago, 3 nights. Well, when she was here, so probably last time was Thursday night, Friday.
Okay. And then your kids, do they sleep in their own beds, or do they sleep with you guys?
Those two adjacent rooms, they connect to that bathroom.
You're lucky.
I'm very lucky right now.
And sheets and stuff are off in the master bedroom.
No, so like when she got back from the airport last night, usually like she just don't sit in the bed. Like most of the time when she does that, she'll want to wash the sheets the next day to get the airport off them since she just came off the airport.
Okay.
That's the only thing I can think of.
But they were still on it when
she
was
in bed. Yeah.
So you were in that bed last night?
Yeah. I was up there because the monitor and stuff was up there. I was waiting for her to get back home.
And then she works from home? Is that right?
Yes, direct sales.
Okay.
Do your kids take any medication?
TC takes Singulair and Omeprazole.
How often?
Singulair is every night for allergies, and Omeprazole for like the acid reflux.
Is one of them on inhalers?
They haven't done it since they got back. I think we might have ran out because the last one I saw had 0 on it, so we hadn't refilled that one yet.
From North Carolina?
Yep.
And when did you guys get back?
I think it was, I went back to work on the 8th, so we got back on the 7th.
Okay.
And then she left for Arizona on Friday and got back last night.
And she had the kids with her last night?
Yes.
Or you had the kids?
Oh, I had the kids like all weekend.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Chris Watts slept in the basement. On the last night, he and Shanann were still together. In other words, August 9th. She left for Arizona on August 10th. While they were in North Carolina, they slept apart for the entire week that he was there. We know that that's true from many people. We know that it's true from Shanann herself, based on her texts. We know that's true from Watts's version in the third confession. We know that's true from what the Rusek said when they stayed there. And we know that Watts basically, when he left for North Carolina, it was basically leaving the sort of flourish of an affair and the blossoms of an affair, and certainly the high that he was on when he, coming away from that weekend at the sand dunes, which I think made a huge impression on him and was sort of almost like left like a honeymoon glow on him, and then going from that sort of magical experience to the misery, for him at least, at Myrtle Beach and all that kind of thing. And so even for himself, he didn't want to enjoy himself. He didn't want to let Shanann back in emotionally. He didn't want to let his children back in emotionally. And he wanted to sort of, almost by locking them out, he wanted to keep Kessinger in. I think it was both a case of him wanting that, but also Kessinger wanting that. I think Kessinger was sort of somewhere else and concerned that if he was with his family, she would lose her hold over him, kind of thing. So so the basement fitted in with that whole thing in terms of, what's interesting is when he came back from North Carolina, then that's when he slept in the basement, and so that would also be a time that he could say, well, to his mistress, well, I'm back home, but I'm not going to be sleeping in the communal bed, kind of thing. And the real question is, when was that bed put in the basement? When was that bed used, for the last time prior to returning from North Carolina. And there are a few possibilities. We know that other people stayed in the house. We know that the Ruseks lived with them for 15 months, so it's possible that they used that bed as well once upon a time. But it would be interesting to know what the history is of that bed. From the version that we're getting, that it was only sort of brought back into use at the very last moment, and that's really interesting. The fact that if you take it literally, it means that what slept in that bed in the basement, kind of for the first time after a long time, but to be a bit more explicit, we know that what's sort of slept over at Kessinger for the entire month of July. So what one's got to remember here is that for a very long time he didn't actually sleep in his own home, never mind which bed in his own home. So he wasn't at home for a really long time. And so you kind of have a situation now where, now that he's not sleeping in Kessinger's home or in her bed, where is he going to be sleeping? And so the answer is, when he was in North Carolina, well, he would then sleep alone. He would maintain that habit. And then when he got home, then for the first time, essentially, he's now choosing a different bed, right? And this was the bed in the basement. But if we accept the scenario, then it raises the question, when Shanann arrived back from Arizona on Sunday night, which became Monday morning, why would he sleep in bed upstairs? I mean, he's been maintaining this sort of vigil, and based on what he said in the third confession, and how he wanted to sort of keep Kessinger happy, based on his version of that anyway, he he wouldn't have wanted to sleep in the family bed. It would have upset her. Now one can argue that that his mistress wouldn't have known either way where he was sleeping, and that maybe he wanted to sleep in his bed. I don't think that holds up, because when he was in North Carolina, Kessinger wasn't there to sort of know. He was in a remote location for many days, and any one of those days he could have slept in the same bed as his wife, and it doesn't appear that that's the case. So when he's back home, why would he sort of take that risk, in inverted commas, of sort of agitating his mistress or upsetting her, whatever it is? So that brings us back to the 111-minute conversation. Wasn't that part of the conversation? Where are you sleeping tonight? Where is Shanann sleeping? Are you going to see her? What are you going to say to her? What's happening? But basically, where are you going to be, and where is she going to be, and where is that going to leave us? Are you guys going to get back together? Can you assure me that you're not going to get together? So the sleeping arrangements are really important, and in any crime that occurs at night, they are crucially important. We can see the same thing playing out in other very high-profile cases, like John Benet Ramsey and the Madeleine McCann case, and even the Amanda Knox case. Irrespective of your position on any of those cases, the sleeping habits are actually a very critical keyhole that allows one to get a really penetrating insight into all three of those cases, and the same applies to Chris Watts. And so what I've always found ridiculous, and I understand that not everyone is a true crime rocket scientist, and understand that not everyone is very well versed in true crime, but the idea that, and a lot of people, by far the majority of people, seem to maintain that, yeah, it makes absolute sense that Chris Watts was sleeping in his bed at home, and then Shanann arrived, and in any event, whatever he said happened, did happen. And then the reinforcing sort of information for that is the fact that you have this sort of bedding narrative, that the bed was stripped and that the bed sheet was used, and that he said that, from the beginning he said that people were murdered in their beds, and he felt to get into bed. And so because he says that, it must be true, right? Now, once again, and I've spoken about this before, you're not intuiting this from the perspective of Chris Watts, and you're not intuiting this from the perspective of the dynamics of the affair, and you're not intuiting it from the perspective of criminal psychology. So, to you it may seem completely normal and make sense and be comfortable, where a murderer just sort of lies in bed and waits for his prey to get into bed right next to him. But that just shows like a really naive appreciation for the personality of Chris Watts, the identity of Chris Watts, his introverted nature and his non-confrontational nature. He doesn't want to be confronted by Shanann. He doesn't want to confront her either. But other people don't know that. So when he tells the police, he wanted to talk to her about the separation, not even the affair. He wants to talk to her about the separation. Well, they'd been talking all week about how they weren't very happy. So why would he need to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning to talk about it? So it just doesn't really make sense. But that's not going to figure in people's minds, because that's not how they're thinking. But that's not really what matters. It doesn't matter how we think about it, it's how he thinks about it. So if we go to 2352 in the clip that I provided on the blog post on crimerocket.com, Chris Watts is asked about the bed in the basement. He's asked who's sleeping there, and you can see there's nervousness. He stumbles over whether it was 2 or 3 nights ago. It's not a big deal. When did you sleep in the basement? And he's sort of got to, he's quite good with numbers, but now he's got to try and work out, how far back are we going? And in a way, there's a bit of reality leaking out here, because when do you count back 2 or 3 nights? Do you count it back Sunday night, which would have made it, so going back from Sunday night to Saturday night to Friday night? Well, it was actually Thursday night that he slept in the basement, right? We don't really have a good idea where he slept on the other nights, but it seems like he only slept in the basement on that Thursday night. So the first night that he was back and Shanann was back. That's quite an important point to remember. So so when Shanann was away, then it looks like he didn't have a problem sleeping in the bed, upstairs. One reason being, he could be closer to his children and he could hear what was going on there. But I think that also plays into the circumstances of Sunday night, Monday morning, is he would need to be close to his children to hear if something was going wrong. So he would need to be in the bed, but that night his wife's supposed to be coming home, so he wouldn't want to be there, in a sense. And so he wouldn't want to look after his children, and so on and so on and so on. I don't want to get into that too much, except just to say there's quite a lot that we can intuit by just dealing with the sleeping arrangements and talking about, the whole narrative, the whole bed narrative, if you want to put it that way, going back weeks, but then also dealing with the, strictly speaking, dealing with the bed narrative in the last few nights, right? And so, just in the narrow confines of him talking to these officers, given his spiel, that they're separating and that he was supposedly sleeping in the basement at the time, why would he, on the night of the murders, the disappearance in his story, why would he sleep upstairs? So you're having a situation where, it's almost like it's premeditated in the sense that he's almost conveying the sense that he's sleeping in the bed upstairs because he wants to sort of be there to tell his wife, well, I want to get separated, but that's a mismatch. That's a psychology that doesn't add up. I mean, one way to communicate the fact that I want to separate is the fact that you're going to find me not sleeping in the bedroom upstairs. That's going to communicate that, right? And, I think in an authentic situation, if this was the authentic Watts narrative, without the disappearance, without the murders, if he wasn't going to commit murder, he would have slept in the basement, and Shanann may have arrived home and then gone to her bedroom, and then Watts isn't sleeping there. And how would she have reacted? She probably would have reacted like, yeah, well, this is the same as North Carolina. Or she would have reacted, yeah, I think that alert that I got did mean something. Something is wrong. Or she would have reacted, so I guess this whole thing with, the romantic trip to Aspen, we're still going to have to work this out. So goodness knows what she would have thought, but one can almost imagine her arriving home, but being really tired, and then just thinking, well, look, he's not here, I'm just going to sleep and I'll deal with it later on. And in a way, during the week in North Carolina, that was how Shanann sort of played it. Shanann sort of had her instincts, she had her intuitions, but she didn't really act on them. And if you consider how almost militant and aggressive she was in terms of Nutgate, she was definitely seemed to be more reserved in terms of what. It's almost like she was afraid of finding out the truth. It's almost like she was afraid that, how can I put it? It's almost like she knew what the truth was, but she didn't want it acknowledged, and that's something Watts actually said. He said that she knew it, but she simply didn't want to say it. So what's interesting is if we go to the first confession in the discovery documents, then there's the moment where he talks to his father. And this is on page 603 of the discovery documents. He says, Chris told his dad he was sorry, and Ronnie told him he knew he was sorry. Chris said he knew Shanann knew in her heart about his affair, but she was waiting for him to admit it. Chris said she believed, okay, so that I think is actually quite true, is I think that Shanann did suspect it, and she did know in her heart about the affair. I don't think she knew it in a black and white way, but I think she strongly suspected it, and she was in denial. So I think it's true that she was in denial, and I think he suspected she was in denial as well, and he kind of used it against her. I think he kind of knew that she was relying on him and needed him to, because of the situation she was in, because of the pregnancy, and so he kind of had her under his thumb in a way, and that gave him some leverage. But I think it's a very interesting thing that Shanann knew in her heart about his affair, and I think this is something other women need to sort of be aware of in their lives. If you have a suspicion, find out. Don't be in denial. Don't be ignorant, right? If we go to the second confession, and this is from the CBI report from February, this is page 5. The agents are questioning him about, what happened when Shanann arrived home, and he felt her get into bed, and then the document states that he felt Shanann stirring around in bed, and he felt like she knew he was having an affair, right? So that's a repeat several months later from prison, this idea that he felt that she knew he was having an affair. And then we go to page 6, and it refers to him being concerned that Shanann knew about his affair and she and the kids wouldn't be there when he got home from work that evening. So I think that's also a very misunderstood and underestimated point, is that if Shanann suspected he was having an affair and he had not taken matters into his own hands in the horrible way that he did, then it seems like what he was concerned about was that he would arrive home from work that day, that Monday, and there would be a problem. I don't think he was worried that his children wouldn't be home, but I think he was worried about other things. And he sort of says here he felt like either Shanann would take the kids away from the house, which I don't think is a legitimate fear that he had. Maybe it was, but or she would lock him out when he tried to come home after work. Now we know that Shanann had sort of already locked his parents out of the equation, so he knew that Shanann was capable of locking people out, right? If she felt they'd crossed him. In terms of this sort of scenario, and this is from February, this is the second confession, he asked Shanann if they could cancel their trip to Aspen. He asked Shanann if they could move to Brighton so they could get away from their house. And he felt that going out with Kessinger on that Saturday evening was the last straw. In this scenario, which is also not true, Shanann told him she knew there was someone else and cried, but then he denied having the affair, and then he says, I just felt guilty, more guilty than ever before. I don't think he felt guilty, but I think he felt uncomfortable, and he felt he was in a corner. And it was the last straw, but it was more the last straw from his perspective of, well, it's the last straw, and now you're going to die, kind of thing. I don't think he felt that. I mean, if he really felt guilty, he wouldn't have done what he did. So I don't think that's the case. What's interesting on page 21 of the CBI report, again, this is what came out in February. He says his mother believed that his father was having an affair because he couldn't account to her for missing money. So yeah, you kind of have a mirror, the sins of the father sort of thing, where something happened with his own parents, where there was a situation of an affair and money that wasn't being accounted for. And in a way it makes one think, did Watts get ideas from that? Did Watts feel almost entitled to do something similar because of that? So that's, I think, also an interesting dynamic that hasn't really been gone. We haven't gone into that very much. For those who are interested in the what side of things, I have published excerpts from the book All My Broken Pieces on crimerocket2.com, so you can check that out. It's crimerocket and then the number 2.com, and you can see some of what Cindy Watts has said. A lot of people have been angry and upset, but what you do get through this additional narrative is just a sense of that there were other dynamics at work in this whole story. As much as you may not like this or that character, the fact is there were psychological dynamics that were playing and that were sort of pulling invisible psychological strings on these people, And when we hate them and we dislike them and we judge them, you sever all those strings. You're not acknowledging them and you're not seeing them because you projecting your own bias over the whole thing. And that's no way to understand true crime. You've got to look at it from the inside out, and then you can make a judgment. Then you can say, well, I don't like this person, or I don't like what is done there. Typically when you do it from that inside out, you don't come out the other end full of judgment. You kind of come out the other end in a way just aware of the size of life and the size of your own world, and also the size of the worlds of other people. You sort of just get a reality shift in terms of how the dynamics of your own life are sort of playing out, and how much one is not acknowledging them in yourself or in others. And so as soon as we sort of exert judgment in true crime, we actually not only dehumanize these criminals who aren't certainly the best of the bunch, it's not the cream of the crop, but we also dehumanize ourselves. And we should be looking at true crime to say, this is a cautionary tale. This is something that can happen to my neighbor, or could even happen to me. God forbid. But even it doesn't even have to happen in terms of a crime. It can just happen through deceits and through treachery and things like that. And by understanding true crime, we can understand how societies function through the schema of these sort of criminal scenarios, right? That's really where the value lies. So in terms of what's sleeping in the basement, all things being equal, had he not intended to murder her, and had they really been in the process of separating, then he'd have slept in the basement and neither of them would have seen each other the next morning. She would not have woken him up, and he wouldn't have wanted to be woken up, and he would not have woken her up when he left, and she would not want to be woken up after sleeping for only 2 hours. When we go through the phone data review, as I've said, we can see that the idea of separating, moving and selling the house had been broached before, which is why the spiel is so unlikely. That he would be desperate to talk to her then at 4 o'clock in the morning, given how late that she arrived home. It's so in a way her arriving late really messed up what he was trying to do, but he did it anyway. And I think that shows how sort of addled his brain was. I think his brain was addled by lust and other things, but I also think it was addled by, to some extent, by being sort of on turbo boost, on turbo drive, based on the Thrive, based on all these supplements the whole time. In other words, he was racing ahead so quickly that he didn't stop to sort of check himself, right? He didn't get off the roller coaster, and he talked about being on a roller coaster and punching the ticket. I think there are a few reasons for him being on this roller coaster. Part of it was sex, part of it was the energy that was part of this. Some of it, almost like from internal combustion, but I think some of it also from supplements and things like that, giving him energy and giving him a new lease on life. But part of these supplements, and Kissinger mentioned it, they keep you up at night, and they give you a lot more energy than you would otherwise have. And in fact, Shanann's very last Facebook update from home was to say how much she'd done, that she'd packed this and she'd cleaned the house, and she did all that powered by Thrive. So I think as much as it's giving you that energy, it's also in a way preventing one from slowing down and taking sort of a sober a sober view of what is actually going on. You know, maybe energy drinks and whatnot, you know, like caffeinated coffee, maybe that's good for a accelerated lifestyle, but is it very good for you know, is that lifestyle actually so good for us? Maybe we should slow down and think about the details and not overlook things in our race to get where we want to go. So yeah, so this whole idea that the fact that Shanann arrived home so late and that he got up so early and that they would have this conversation anyway, the fact that that would just sort of make sense is odd. It's a failure in this whole scenario, and it's interesting that he went ahead with it anyway. But the reason he's doing it, and the reason he's not in his right mind, and why the whole thing doesn't make sense, is because through this manufactured drama, he's confirming to Kessinger that they are separated at the moment they reunited. He is moving, in terms of moving out the house, at the very moment she's back in Colorado for the long term, and that nothing has changed. This is in terms of him and Kessinger. Whereas at that moment everything had changed, meaning now that the family are back together, they're not, and he can still see her. If this is confusing, let me just go through this again. You have a manufactured drama, and by that I mean you're having a situation that's not real in the real sense of the word, if that makes sense. In other words, when you're worried about what someone else is thinking or doing, that's a manufactured drama. And so even when you communicate to that other person your worries, then you giving them your manufactured drama, and then what they may then do is give you back a manufactured drama. It's very, very difficult to get out of a manufactured drama in a situation of an affair, because someone's got to be given the short end of the stick. So in other words, you know, if there's a love triangle and one person is cheating on another, but effectively it's two people cheating on a third party, then someone is going to get a manufactured drama. You know, there's no way to cheat in a honest way, and there's no way to cheat in a way that is factual, and I don't know how to put it in another way, by the book or something like that. You know, if one watches Survivor, you know, you invariably find as you get to the end of the game, people just being completely indignant that somebody lied to them. Now everyone is cheating, everyone is lying, and then people are totally, you know, indignant that somebody cheated to them and that they were lied to. But I mean, Survivor's all about the best manufactured drama, the best spiel that, you know, involves other people and that other people can go along with, which meanwhile kind of undermines other people, right? That's what I mean by manufactured drama. And so the manufactured drama in this scenario is that he's telling Kessinger that they are separated, but they're not. He's not separated with his wife in any real way, but he needs to manufacture this drama, and the murders were kind of an extension of this manufactured drama. So at the moment he's reunited with his wife, he's sort of forcing the narrative to come true that they are separated. He's separating himself from them through these crimes, right? But what I'm just trying to emphasize is that they aren't actually separated. So when Shanann's returning home, she's sort of wondering, you know, am I going to be doing this gender reveal? Are we going to go to Aspen? What does that credit card charge? Even though he is having an affair, you know, can we maybe work this out? And, you know, I'm going to carry on with my life. I'm going to take my daughters to school, right? So they aren't actually separated. And then the other part of the drama is he is moving. No, he's not. he's not moving anywhere. I mean, where was he going to move to? That hasn't even been identified. Is he moving to the basement? Even in the spiel, he's not moving to the basement, so he's not moving anywhere. And this is why you kind of have the situation. He knows they're not separated. He knows he's not moving, and he knows nothing has actually changed, which is why he commits the crime to, in a way, honor what is being committed to all along. That he will move, that things will change, and things are separated. People may also look at this and say, but that's crazy. Why have a manufactured thing like this when you could just do it? Just get separated, actually move out the house, and actually change things. But I think people need to, again, acknowledge the fact that you're dealing with, on the one hand, a very introverted, caved in, crushed in, cowardly person, and on the one hand, and on the other, a very controlling, not just a controlling, but a very controlling personality, and also one that can be quite fearsome when confronted with something unpleasant like Nutgate, or even 1,000 times worse, an affair while you're pregnant. You can imagine, if you're already terrified of that, if you're already terrified of how someone's responding to Nutgate, what's the terror going to be when it's something really serious, right? So yeah, through this scenario of which I call a manufactured drama, what is essentially waving a wand and granting Kessinger and himself wish fulfillment, which makes total sense to him and her, but makes no sense to anyone else. So, you can't look at this case and understand it by simply looking at it from the outside. If you want to understand it, you've got to look at it from the perspective of Kessinger, which I know no one wants to do, and also from the perspective of the dynamic between Watts and Kessinger and Watts. I think one of the least discussed dynamics is the one from Kessinger to Watts, and it's easy for people to think that that's irrelevant and that doesn't equate to anything, but it does. So if we go to 2241 in the clip, the officer asks about the children's medications, and that's another area I want to touch on but briefly. What says CC takes Singulair every night for allergies. Now this is quite important. It means that every single night there's the administration of medicine. It means that the children are habituated to taking medicine, right? Ingesting some kind of medication. What would it mean if Watts exchanged something that he was giving, or that CC was receiving every night, and instead of Singulair he gave her oxycodone, like a really big dose of it? The other aspect which I brought up in I think another episode is the fact that people that are very allergic can have very adverse reactions to oxycodone. So literally someone that's an asthma sufferer or that has got severe allergies can have a very bad reaction to oxycodone. And the reason is oxycodone in high doses, in too high doses, works to suppress, I don't think suppress is the right word, it's repress. So it represses respiration. So in other words, at high doses, one of the impacts of this drug is that it's like someone sitting on your lungs. It just reduces the respiration of a person, and this is why people can die of overdose. You lose consciousness, and then you're in a state of kind of being asleep or in a kind of a coma, and then in that state you just stop breathing. It's not so much asphyxiation. It's not so much, you're not being smothered to death. You're simply having your respiratory system turned off, right, while you unconscious. So that's quite an important thing to bear in mind, is that what's new that his children had these, I don't want to call them defects, but certainly these conditions that where he knew that their breathing was not 100%, if I can put it that way. And so in another sense, it almost makes sense that he would prey on an existing weakness. I'm not going to go into that further, but what is interesting is the slip that Watts makes, where the officer says to him, and again, bear in mind, Watts has been out all day. He's been talking to numerous officers. At this point, there are 3 officers talking to him, and so the one says, I think it's Coonrod, says to him, "She had the kids last night," and he Watts looks very smug at this point. His lower jaw is sort of hanging open in kind of a dopey way, as if he's sort of taking on all comers, and he's feeling good about his game. And then he answers, "Yes, she had the kids last night, yes." And then the officer edits his own remark, and he says, "Or you had the kids." And then Watts stops himself and says, "Oh, I had the kids." Now, what I think is potentially significant with that slip is just that statement, "She had the kids last night." Now we know she didn't, right? So we know that Shanann didn't have the kids. Shanann wasn't even in the house. But think about that statement. It's basically saying, were the kids in your custody last night, right? And by saying she had the kids last night is another way of saying, so the kids weren't in your custody last night, right? And then he answers yes. And that may be a slip. That may be a slip referring to the reality of Sunday night. I'm talking about fairly early Sunday night. It is the position of True Crime Rocket Science that the children were killed quite early in the evening. As early as 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. And part of the reason I say that is when Shanann asked for photos of the children in bed, Watts couldn't give them to her. And Watts wasn't the kind of person to just not do what Shanann asked. If Shanann asked something, he did it. So why didn't he do that, right? The other reasons as well, I'm not going to go into that there, but I do think this was an interesting slip. And that then brings us to the drug interactions between Imitrex and oxycodone. This is another aspect that I don't think has been dealt with very much. I certainly haven't seen discussions about it, but there is a. So first, let me just be clear. There are. Chris Watts was aware that Shanann was using Imitrex, and he was also absolutely aware of all the medications that his children were using. Like, he could name them without any hesitation. He could say it was omeprazole. Let me just make sure of that. Omeprazole, and then Singulair, and and everything else. But he could also name the medication that Shanann was on, and we know that he googled oxycodone, and as it turns out, there is a specific contraindication between Imitrex and oxycodone. and this is it. They say it's a moderately serious contraindication. It says using oxycodone together with Imitrex can increase the risk of a rare but serious condition called serotonin syndrome, which includes symptoms such as confusion, hallucinations, seizures, extreme changes in blood pressure, increased heart rate, fever, shivering, shaking, blurred vision, muscle spasm, vomiting. Severe cases may result in coma and even death. One of the potential explanations for why Shanann didn't act in a more effective way and in a more sort of direct way to what may have been because she was compromised by these sort of secretive overdoses that he was giving her. So in other words, because Shanann is sort of distracted by her own poor health, right? She's pregnant, she's trying to be pregnant, she's trying to take care of herself, and she's sort of distracted by that and kind of preoccupied with that while everything's going on. So in other words, that's a kind of a distraction, as a way to occupy her time, occupy her mind, occupy her emotions, occupy her energy, just a way to sort of keep her focused on something else. And if you think that that's silly, just imagine if that wasn't there. So imagine Shanann and Chris Watts on their first night together in North Carolina. Shanann's completely healthy, and now this is Watts' first night home, right? Well, it's an opportunity for the two to talk and to be together and to deal with stuff and to catch up and to ... right? But if Shanann's sick and not sleeping and all that, and if when she's supposed to be sleeping, she's sick, this is compromising her for the whole week, where she's not going to be feeling well, and so she's not up to, she's sort of not, she's not herself, and so she's not up to sort of declaring World War III or whatever it is that she might otherwise do, given what's his behavior, right? Then there's also drug and food interactions. It talks about this is a major contraindication. Do not use alcohol or medications that contain alcohol while you're receiving treatment with oxycodone. Now, what's possible with this is, can you imagine someone purposefully combining oxycodone with alcohol? This causes very severe reactions. I'm not quite sure how you would do it in practice, especially in a scenario where Shanann's arriving home. But if he really wanted to cause a miscarriage by combining alcohol with the oxycodone, that certainly would have been more effective. So I just think it's important to be aware of these aspects. I don't know whether they're that relevant to Shanann. I do think they are relevant, but it's worth looking not only into the dynamics of human beings, but also the dynamics of these drugs. And we shouldn't end it there. We should also look at the pharmacodynamics of these drugs, and then also look at what impact does oil have on, are these certain chemicals soluble in oil or not? And that is something that I've dealt with in some detail in Silver Fox. People seem to forget that oil isn't a simple substance. It's not like water or it's not a homogeneous substance. It's kind of filled with a smorgasbord of many different chemicals, and they go on and on and on. They contain octane and just all sorts of names, what butanol and al al alkanes, I think it is, but just a whole lot of substances. It depends what you're talking about, if it's crude oil or natural gas. You get all sorts of permutations of this chemical potpourri, but they basically, you must bear in mind that what we're dealing with are dissolved organisms, right? I mean, the fact of oil is that they are dissolved, what used to be living creatures, as dissolved tissues. And so the idea that you're gonna, if you add something like a certain kind of chemical into another brew of chemicals which are based around a brew of dissolved organisms, there are a whole host of possibilities. It's quite technical. I don't really mean to get into that here, but it certainly is worth going into to understand what seems to be the inexplicable autopsy reports. And now I want to finally address this idea of, remember in the beginning of this episode we were talking about when what trumps himself with a version that's worse than the previous version, well, that must be the truth. That's been the very simplistic attitude of a lot of people, that why would he lie when this version really doesn't make him look good. And my response always has been, well, because the reality is actually much worse. And I spoke to the journalist about this as well, and she wasn't convinced either. And when you don't have a very deep understanding of this case, and when you sort of look at it superficially, I agree it's not a very convincing argument. But when you do, when you understand the dynamics and you understand the criminal psychology, you can see why these kind of worse versions still don't hold a candle to the actual version. And I'm going to try and very briefly explain that in my conclusion now, why I say that. The True Crime Rocket Science position obviously is that Chris Watts overdosed his children. So that's something he's never admitted to, right? And you might say, well, that's not so bad. It's not so bad to do that. But it is. It's more heinous to overdose one's children in their sleep, to lace their dinner with their mother's deadly painkiller drug, and then blame their mother for their murders. That's far more heinous than the version that is given to date, which is that Shanann killed the children. I'm talking about, if the Shanann killed the children, that is terrible to us, but it reflects quite well on him. It means he didn't kill the children, right? If he gives a situation where he kills the children as an afterthought, that reflects quite well on him. It means he didn't know what he was doing, he was out of his mind, he can't be held accountable because he was sort of he was not himself or something like that. And as bad as whatever he's saying it was, that he just, for whatever reason, he just picked up a blanket and smothered his one child and then the other child. It doesn't seem, it's bad, it's very bad, but it doesn't really seem so bad. I mean, it's, well, I'm not sure what I'm doing and then I did it. Well, it's terrible, but there's a version that's worse than that, and the version that's worse than that is where he plans to do it, and he plans to do it not 5 minutes before the time or 10 minutes before the time, but weeks before the time and days before the time. And while they're at a birthday party, he's thinking, on the one hand about his mistress, but on the other hand about how to get rid of these children that are laughing in front of him. As distasteful as his acts were at Survey 319, dumping a dead body in an oil tank is no more or less painful for the victim than granting them a proper burial. So if these children were buried where they are now, in a proper burial, it would have made no difference ultimately to the end result, in terms of how Bella would have experienced what happened to her and Cece. I don't know if you follow that. Whether their bodies were dropped inside a scalding volcano or shot out into space, as insensitive as that sounds, Bella and Cece wouldn't have felt it. I'm talking about after they died. Whatever happens to their body, as disgusting as it is to us, the living, in terms of the experience of the victims, it's not going to make a difference. And for that matter, their deaths from an overdose, they wouldn't have felt either. But that's not the point. The point isn't, how it would have felt for the victims. The point is, by killing them in this way, we see precisely how calculated and cold-blooded the silver fox could be. That's what we're really getting at. And that is why we're getting all these versions that aren't true, because the reality is unacceptable, and he knows it. It was simply because his own children were in the way of his starting a new life with a new wife and allowing her to be the first best choice to raise effectively a new brood of fox pups. I'm going to get rid of these children so that someone else can be the new, the new mother, and to do that, the pups at home had to be done away with. And people think it's being insensitive. It's not being insensitive. I'm using this analogy just to show why the psychology that I'm talking about makes sense. A simple equation of pluses and minuses. It's more than that. It's the reality of a father playing custodian 1 second and a sly, deadly predator the next, seemingly on a whim. This is the real terror, not the oil or the oil tanks. And what I find is, when a lot of people read some of the blogs that I write, read some of the books that I write, they will stop at a certain point and say, I can't believe that he said that. And because they want to jump the gun. And so this is another example of that, is where you make the case about this, and I'm trying to make the case here that the psychology of Watts is much worse than we imagine. If you stop me before I've made that point, you're going to say, no, I'm comparing two children to pups, and I'm not. What I'm doing is I'm trying to illustrate the reality of this case as I see it, and that it is that it's a lot worse than any of the versions we've gotten so far. So I hope that is clear. I hope that's clear. And almost as frightening as this premeditated scenario as it actually was, almost as frightening as that is the fact that so many, by far the majority following this case, remain unaware of this, right? Most are continuing to believe it. Most continue to believe, like this journalist that I spoke to, that Watts killed his children at the well site kind of as an afterthought. So even in their disbelief, the sly silver fox still holds them in his fictitious thrall. And it's the work of True Crime Rocket Science to undo that and to show the truth. And I hope that those who are new to True Crime Rocket Science, I hope that you willing to challenge your own views of this case, even though the majority actually believe otherwise. There are a lot of commentators out there that stick to kind of a majority view, and they're simply just parroting often a lot of what Watts says. And that's not what True Crime Rocket Science does. What we do is we try to see what's hidden. We try to tell the fact from the fabric of the lies, and we try to get to the actual objective reality. And reality is a slippery thing. Reality is a thing that often doesn't look like we think it does. We think reality looks like we think it does, but reality tends to look like it does, if that makes sense. So if you've enjoyed this episode, I know at times it's been a little bit rambling, but if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, leave a comment, like the video, and thanks for listening. The series of books, the 9-part Two-Face series, are available on Amazon Kindle. One of them, Oblivion, is available in paperback, and the next book, Silver Fox, will be coming out soon, dealing with the third confession, and dealing only with Chris Watts. It's not going to be dealing so much with the dynamics of other people. It's really going to be dealing specifically with him. And although it may not seem that way, I know a lot of people in previous months and so on, every time a new confession has come out, people have said, oh, are you going to now change what you said because this is now the truth? And so ironically, with the third confession coming out, it's not a case that what has been said previously in other narratives gets changed. If anything, it gets reinforced. And the primary one of these is the oxycodone narrative. That is something that I mentioned in the very first narrative, that the children were overdosed, and I also mentioned the fact that maybe Shanann was overdosed, and whether it was used to create a miscarriage. So this isn't new to the True Crime Rocket Science, but it is, I think, new to the public narrative, and it's interesting that the media aren't talking about it. So that is why we live in a world where reality seems to be very slippery and hard to find. Anyway, thank you for listening. Be sure to follow the coverage of this case at crimerocket.com and crimerocket2.com. I've also written a lot of other books that are intertextual to this one, including Treachery, the series on Casey Anthony, and the trilogy on Scott Peterson. There's also quite a lot that's relevant there, where Lacey also started feeling very bad and poorly in the last days of her life, and could something have happened there? I believe something was happening there. I also believe that she was being sedated or drugged in some way, and these narratives definitely help to understand the Chris Watts case, as different as they seem to be. The Casey Anthony case deals with the death of a child, and the Scott Peterson case deals with the murder of a pregnant woman. And so between those two cases you have a lot of the fabric that plays into the Watts case. So if you've already read the Watts series, you should really have a look at those. It's very, very interesting.
But understand that at this point, I still can't answer questions about the facts surrounding the investigation.
Really all everyone wanted throughout was justice for Shanann and Bella and Celeste. We're certainly pleased this seems to be the outcome.
I think all of those who were involved never truly believed that you would give us an accurate statement. What I can tell you most affirmatively today by what happened in Florida is the spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann falsely, incorrectly, and frankly a flat-out lie. spotlight that keep trying to shine on Shanann falsely, incorrectly, frankly, a flat out lie. Come on, take your water out of the house, and Gary. Gary, I didn't know what else to do.
And he's so disgusting, I'm so ashamed of him. Why? Oh, why? How? I don't even understand how you could bring yourself to do that. Somebody was like,
It was a shocking deal news of the week. Occidental increasing its bid for Anadarko to $76 a share.